I was standing on my back porch just as the sun was coming up, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, when I saw my two guard alpacas trotting back toward the pasture like they were coming home from a casual morning stroll. They looked calm, almost proud. One of them had something dangling from its mouth, swinging side to side with every step. It took me a second to realize it was a torn designer handbag. Then I heard the screaming. On the other side of my fence, a woman was losing her mind, pointing at my animals and shouting that I had set them on her. She was shaking, furious, and absolutely convinced she was the victim. What she didn't seem to understand was that she never should have been there in the first place. This whole mess didn't start with the alpacas. It started because she decided my fence didn't apply to her. She cut through it, ignored the warning signs, and treated my land like her personal walking trail. To her, property lines were just suggestions, and rules were for other people. In a minute, I'll explain why that fence mattered, why those alpacas were there, and how her own entitlement ended up destroying her standing in the community. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before all of this blew up, my life in Redwood Hollow was exactly what I had worked years to earn. My name's Ethan Miller, and I moved to this part of Montana because I wanted the opposite of noise. Redwood Hollow isn't the kind of place people stumble into by accident. It's quiet, spread out, and half the reason folks live there is because nobody tells you what to do with your land. You wake up to wind in the trees instead of traffic, and your closest neighbors are far enough away that you don't hear their problems unless you're invited. I bought my property for 4 simple reasons: privacy, land, animals, and peace. I wanted space to breathe, room to raise livestock, and the kind of calm that lets your mind shut off at night. I wasn't trying to make a statement or push boundaries. I just wanted to live my life without someone peering over my shoulder. The fence was part of that. It wasn't some slapped-together thing I threw up to make a point. I had it professionally installed, surveyed, and clearly marked. Every corner matched county records. There were visible signs posted at regular intervals. The fence wasn't there to block anyone's view or make the place look unfriendly. It existed for one reason only: to protect my animals and keep everyone safe. Livestock doesn't mix well with strangers wandering through, especially strangers who don't understand how animals behave. For years, that fence did its job without a single issue. Then Vanessa Clark moved in. She showed up from out of state with a brand new SUV, a perfectly landscaped yard, and the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. Her house sat on higher ground near the edge of the community, close enough to see my property if you were looking for it. From the beginning, she made it clear that she had opinions about how things should look. The first comments were small, almost laughable. She mentioned the smell of animals when the wind shifted. She asked if the fence could be less industrial. She wrinkled her nose at the sight of alpacas grazing like they were some kind of eyesore instead of living creatures. Every complaint was wrapped in a smile, delivered with a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by pointing these things out. What stood out to me was how often she used the phrase community standards. She wasn't on the HOA board. She didn't have any official authority. But she talked like she did, dropping hints about what was expected and what would be better for everyone. She framed her comments as friendly suggestions, but they always pointed in one direction. My land should be more accessible, more attractive, more useful to people other than me. That's when the passive-aggressive behavior started. She'd walk near the fence and comment loudly about how much space was going to waste. She joked about how a walking path would be such a nice feature for the neighborhood. Once, she even suggested that my property could be shared since it wasn't being fully used every minute of the day. She said it like it was common sense, like land ownership was some kind of group project. I brushed most of it off. People talk. Not everyone understands rural living, and I didn't feel like escalating things over comments. I figured if I stayed polite and firm, she'd eventually move on to bothering someone else. But there was something in the way she looked at the fence that bothered me. It wasn't annoyance. It was calculation. Like the fence wasn't a boundary to her, just an obstacle that hadn't been dealt with yet. The obsession with what she called unused space kept coming up. She talked about it the way a developer talks about an empty lot, not the way a neighbor talks about someone else's home. Every time she brought it up, it felt less like conversation and more like justification. The moment that really stuck with me came one morning when I was checking the pasture. The ground near the back fence looked disturbed. At first I thought it was an animal, but the prints were wrong. Too deliberate, too even. Human footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't from anyone who had permission to be there. I followed them along the fence line until they disappeared back toward her side of the property. That was the first real red flag. Not a comment, not a complaint. Physical evidence that someone had been testing the boundary. Standing there, looking at those footprints, I had the uncomfortable realization that Vanessa wasn't just talking anymore. She was already acting like my land belonged to her, and that was before the fence was cut. I found the damage 2 days after I noticed the footprints, and the moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. The fence wasn't bent or pushed aside. It wasn't broken by an animal or damaged by weather. It was cut clean, precise, and deliberate. The opening was wide enough for an adult to step through comfortably, like someone had measured it with intention. There was nothing accidental about it. For a few seconds I just stood there staring at the gap, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. I remember thinking there had to be another explanation. Maybe a contractor made a mistake. Maybe someone thought this section was theirs. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't true. Anger came next, the kind that hits your chest before your head catches up. Someone had crossed from talking to acting. This wasn't a complaint or a passive remark anymore. This was someone physically altering my property, like they had every right to do so. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to breathe, because I knew blowing up wouldn't help me. Losing my temper would only make things worse. That's when restraint kicked in. Instead of confronting anyone, I went straight to my office and pulled up the security footage. I rewound the timeline slowly, watching the hours tick backward until I found what I was looking for. There she was. Vanessa Clark. Clear as day. She walked up to the fence with a pair of cutting tools like she'd done it 100 times before. No hesitation. No checking to see if anyone was watching. She crouched down, cut through the wire, and widened the opening with calm, practiced movements. At one point, she even stood up, brushed dirt off her hands, and glanced directly at the camera. Not startled. Not guilty. Just annoyed, like the camera was an inconvenience. Watching that footage made something click for me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't ignorance. She knew exactly where she was, exactly what she was doing, and exactly who the land belonged to. She simply didn't care. Cutting the fence crossed every line imaginable. It was trespassing. It was property damage. And worse than that, it put my animals at risk. That fence was there to keep livestock contained and safe. A single open gap is all it takes for an animal to wander off, get hurt, or cause an accident. What she did wasn't just disrespectful. It was dangerous. I felt the urge to march over to her house and demand an explanation, but I stopped myself. I've learned over the years that the moment you react emotionally is the moment you lose leverage. So instead, I treated it like a problem that needed to be handled correctly. I repaired the fence that same afternoon, reinforcing the damaged section and making it stronger than before. I added fresh signage along the line, clearly stating private property and no trespassing, placed at eye level where no one could claim they didn't see it. I upgraded my cameras too, adjusting angles and adding coverage so there wouldn't be a single blind spot left. Then I started documenting everything. Dates, times, screenshots, footage clips saved in multiple places, notes about previous conversations and comments she'd made. I didn't know exactly how this would play out, but I knew one thing for sure. If this turned into a dispute, I wasn't going in unprepared. Standing there after everything was fixed, looking at the reinforced fence and the new signs, the truth finally settled in. This wasn't someone who didn't understand boundaries. This was someone who believed boundaries didn't apply to her. This wasn't ignorance. This was entitlement. She came back the very next day, and that's how I knew none of the warnings mattered to her. I was inside when the motion alert on my phone went off. When I pulled up the camera feed, I saw Vanessa walking along the fence line like she was out for a casual stroll. She was dressed comfortably, like someone enjoying a morning walk, and she had her little dog trotting beside her on a thin leash. The way she moved told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't sneaking. She wasn't unsure. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed the land already belonged to her. She stopped right where I had repaired the fence. I watched as she glanced at the new signs, rolled her eyes, and stepped through the opening anyway, as if the fence was nothing more than a suggestion. No hesitation, no second thoughts. She crossed onto my property like she'd been invited. That was when Ranger and Atlas noticed her. The alpacas lifted their heads from the pasture almost in unison. They didn't run. They didn't charge. They did exactly what they were trained to do. They turned their bodies toward the intrusion and began walking in her direction, slow and deliberate, calm but unmistakably alert. Vanessa froze for a second, then laughed nervously and started clapping her hands like she was dealing with misbehaving pets. She yelled at them to shoo and tugged at her dog's leash, trying to pull it closer to her chest. The more she shouted, the more confident she seemed that she could control the situation just by raising her voice. Ranger and Atlas didn't stop. They kept closing the distance, heads high, posture steady, eyes locked on her. That's when her tone changed. The laughter disappeared. Her commands turned sharp, then frantic. She tried stepping backward, still yelling, but panic was starting to creep in. These weren't animals that responded to fear or noise. They weren't backing down, and she could feel it. She turned to run. That's when it all unraveled. Her foot caught in the uneven ground near the fence line, and she went down hard, scrambling to catch herself. She screamed as she fell, the sound sharp and piercing, echoing across the pasture. Her bag slipped off her shoulder and hit the dirt. The dog yapped wildly, spinning in tight circles. Ranger and Atlas stopped just short of her. One of them nudged the fallen bag with his nose. The other grabbed the strap, lifted it clean off the ground, and backed away. Then, just like that, they turned and walked back toward the pasture, the bag swinging like a trophy between them. There was no attack, no bite, no kick. They never touched her or the dog. They did exactly what they were supposed to do: intercept, deter, and remove the object that came with the intruder. Vanessa stayed on the ground for a moment, stunned, then scrambled to her feet, shaking with rage and embarrassment. She screamed across the field, calling me irresponsible, dangerous, and reckless. She threatened to call the authorities. She said I'd be sorry. She said I had no idea who I was messing with. I watched it all from the camera feed, heart pounding but hands steady. As she retreated back through the fence, still yelling and shaking her fist, one thought was crystal clear in my mind. She didn't see this as a warning. She saw it as a challenge, and she was about to find out how badly that would backfire. By that evening, Vanessa had already decided how she wanted the story told. I didn't hear it from her directly. I heard it from my phone, lighting up nonstop with notifications from neighbors and people I barely knew. Screenshots started coming in from the local community group. Vanessa had gone online and posted a long, emotional account of what she claimed had happened. According to her, she had been violently attacked while peacefully walking her dog. She described my alpacas as aggressive, dangerous animals that I had trained to chase people. She painted herself as an innocent victim who barely escaped serious injury. The details got more dramatic with every sentence. She talked about being charged, cornered, and nearly mauled. She hinted that her life had been in danger. She left out one small detail entirely, the part where she cut through my fence and trespassed onto private property. What she didn't expect was that Redwood Hollow isn't the kind of place where people swallow a story whole without asking questions. The comments started coming in fast. Some were sympathetic at first, but it didn't take long for the tone to shift. People asked why she had been anywhere near my pasture in the first place. Others pointed out that my property was clearly fenced and posted. A few neighbors mentioned seeing her walking along my fence line more than once. Someone else asked outright, "Why were you on his land?" That's when the screenshots started circulating. Photos of the fence, images of the warning signs, clips pulled straight from my security footage, showing her stepping through the repaired fence without hesitation. The version of events she had tried to control began slipping through her fingers. Every exaggeration she made only drew more scrutiny. The more she insisted she was a victim, the more people questioned her choices. The next morning, animal control showed up. Officer Luis Ramirez pulled into my driveway in an unmarked vehicle, calm and professional, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself, explained that a complaint had been filed, and asked if we could talk. I invited him in without hesitation. There was nothing I needed to hide. We sat down, and I pulled up the footage. I let it play from the beginning. The fence cutting, the trespassing, the ignored warning signs, the alpacas doing exactly what trained livestock guardians are meant to do. Officer Ramirez watched quietly, occasionally pausing the video to take notes. He didn't interrupt. He didn't jump to conclusions. When the footage ended, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He explained, calmly and clearly, that my animals were not in violation of any regulations. They were properly contained, registered, and behaving within their role. Then he pointed out something that made the whole situation even more ironic. Vanessa's dog wasn't properly registered. In filing her complaint, she had triggered a routine check, and her own paperwork didn't add up. No current registration, no clear documentation. The same rules she thought she could weaponize against me had turned right back on her. Officer Ramirez told me he would be noting the false elements of the report and the evidence of trespassing. He reminded me to keep documenting everything and assured me that, from his perspective, I had handled the situation correctly. When Vanessa was informed of the outcome later that day, the reaction was explosive. She stormed out of the animal control office furious, red-faced, and humiliated. Her attempt to control the narrative had collapsed completely. Instead of being seen as a victim, she'd exposed herself as someone willing to lie, exaggerate, and ignore boundaries to get her way. And the worst part for her was that everyone had seen it happen in real time. The story she tried to tell no longer belonged to her. Losing control of the narrative didn't slow Vanessa down. If anything, it pushed her into a new strategy. When public sympathy and official complaints failed, she shifted to what she clearly believed was her strongest weapon: paperwork. A week after the animal control visit, I received the first letter from the HOA. It was politely worded, but heavy with implication. It referenced a complaint submitted by Vanessa claiming there was a historic walking easement running through my property. According to her, this path had supposedly existed long before I bought the land and had been unfairly blocked by my fence. She described it as a community asset and rebranded it as a wellness trail, something meant to benefit everyone. Reading it, I couldn't help but shake my head. There was no easement. There never had been. My property records were clean, and I knew that for a fact. Still, the letters kept coming. Each one sounded more official than the last. They requested meetings. They hinted at possible fines. They suggested that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. None of it outright accused me of wrongdoing, but the pressure was obvious. Vanessa was trying to bury me under process and intimidation. I attended one of the HOA meetings, just to see how far she was willing to take it. She spoke confidently, presenting printed documents and speaking in rehearsed phrases about accessibility, community health, and shared resources. She talked like the outcome was already decided. When people asked questions, she deflected. When someone mentioned property rights, she dismissed it as technicalities. What she didn't count on was preparation. I went home and pulled every relevant document I had. County records showing clear ownership. Survey maps confirming the boundaries. Zoning confirmations stating exactly what my land could and could not be used for. There was no easement listed anywhere, historic or otherwise. I consulted a local attorney just to be safe, and he confirmed the same thing in plain language: no easement, no obligation, no case. I submitted copies of everything back to the HOA, neatly organized and clearly labeled. No emotion, no commentary, just facts. That should have been the end of it, but Vanessa wasn't ready to let go. A few days later, I looked out toward the fence and saw two unfamiliar trucks parked near the edge of my property. A pair of contractors were unloading tools and materials, looking around like they weren't entirely sure where they were supposed to be. I walked over and asked what they were doing. They told me they had been hired to begin marking a trail based on directions they'd been given. Vanessa had assured them all permissions were in place. They were wrong. I showed them the property lines. I showed them the fence. I explained, calmly, that they were standing on private land and that there was no easement, no approval, and no legal authority for any work to happen there. The realization hit them fast. They packed up their equipment, apologized, and left without argument. When Vanessa found out, her reaction was immediate and furious. She accused me of sabotaging her project and stonewalling the community. But the truth was undeniable. Paperwork wasn't saving her. The facts were stacked against her, and every attempt to push forward only exposed how thin her claims really were. For the first time since this started, I could see it on her face. She was running out of moves. By the time Vanessa made her final move, desperation had taken over where confidence used to be. The polite letters had failed. The public sympathy play had collapsed. The paperwork hadn't worked. What she tried next wasn't clever or strategic. It was reckless. Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed with motion alerts. I didn't see them until early morning, but when I pulled up the footage, the story unfolded clearly. There she was again, moving through the darkness with a flashlight, heading straight for the pasture gate. She wasn't trying to sneak anymore. She was trying to force a result. The footage showed her dragging materials toward the gate, attempting to block it shut from the outside. Whether she thought she could trap the animals or force the issue by creating an emergency, I'll never know. What I do know is that she crossed into something far more serious. This wasn't just trespassing or property damage anymore. This was interference with livestock and intentional obstruction. Every second of it was recorded. She struggled with the gate, fumbling in the dark, clearly frustrated. At one point, she stopped and looked directly toward the camera, as if daring someone to stop her. Then she left, convinced she had finally gained the upper hand. She was wrong. The next day, the HOA called an emergency meeting. Word had spread quickly that something serious had happened, and the room was packed. Vanessa arrived looking tense but defiant, clutching a folder like it was a shield. She spoke first, claiming she had been forced to take action because I refused to cooperate. Then it was my turn. I laid everything out, calmly and methodically. The original fence cutting, the trespassing, the false reports, the fabricated easement, the contractors, and finally, the footage from that night. I played the video from start to finish without saying a word. You could feel the shift in the room. People leaned forward. Whispers spread. Faces changed. The timeline made it impossible to deny what had been happening all along. This wasn't a neighbor trying to improve the community. This was someone repeatedly violating boundaries and lying to cover it up. When the video ended, no one rushed to defend her. The HOA board went into a brief closed discussion and returned with their decision. Vanessa was stripped of any informal influence she had been wielding. Fines were issued for false filings and misconduct. A formal trespass notice was approved and delivered, making it clear that she was no longer allowed anywhere near my property. She sat there stunned, the folder in her hands suddenly useless. The rules she had tried to bend and weaponize had finally turned against her. That meeting was the end of it, not because I won an argument, but because the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. The change didn't happen all at once, but it was unmistakable. After the emergency meeting, Redwood Hollow seemed to exhale. The tension that had been hanging over the community for weeks finally lifted, and life started to slide back into something that felt normal again. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No more letters. No more surprise visits. No more complaints disguised as concerns. The fence stood exactly where it always had, only now it was reinforced, stronger than before, and inspected from end to end. I added one final camera angle for good measure, not because I expected trouble, but because I had learned how quickly peace can be tested when someone decides rules don't apply to them. Neighbors started reaching out in small ways. Some stopped by to apologize for staying quiet earlier. Others admitted they had felt uneasy about Vanessa's behavior but hadn't known how to speak up. A few thanked me outright for standing firm, saying it had reminded everyone that property lines and boundaries actually meant something. In a place like Redwood Hollow, that mattered. Vanessa, on the other hand, faded into the background. Where she had once walked confidently through the neighborhood, she now kept her head down. If we crossed paths, she avoided eye contact completely. The loud opinions and constant complaints vanished. No more talk about wellness trails or community standards. It was like someone had flipped a switch, and the person who had tried to dominate every conversation no longer wanted to be seen at all. Word spread quietly that her house had been listed for sale. There was no announcement. No dramatic goodbye. Just a "for sale" sign that appeared one morning and stayed there. People noticed, but no one said much. It didn't need commentary. Everyone understood what it meant. The community had drawn a line, and she had run out of space to push against it. What stuck with me most was how the neighborhood changed afterward. Conversations felt easier. People respected each other's space a little more. There was an unspoken understanding that boundaries weren't negotiable just because someone was loud or persistent. The situation had been uncomfortable, but it left behind a lesson that didn't need repeating. The day the moving truck arrived, I watched from a distance. Boxes were loaded quietly. No arguments, no speeches, just the sound of work being done. When the truck finally pulled away, the road felt emptier and somehow calmer. As the dust settled, Ranger and Atlas grazed peacefully behind the fence, the same way they always had. The land was still mine. The peace had returned. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like Redwood Hollow was whole again. Looking back on everything that happened, the lesson feels simple now, even though it didn't feel that way while I was living through it. Entitlement only works when no one pushes back. The moment it runs into documentation, cameras, and facts, it collapses under its own weight. Paper trails don't care about confidence, and video doesn't care how convincing someone sounds. I also learned that animals don't respond to excuses or entitlement. Ranger and Atlas didn't know who Vanessa was, what she thought she deserved, or what story she planned to tell afterward. They reacted to behavior, not words. Boundaries were crossed, and they did exactly what they were trained to do, calmly, without emotion, and without hesitation. More than anything, I learned that staying calm is a form of strength. There were plenty of moments when I wanted to argue, confront, or escalate things. But every time I chose patience over anger, it worked in my favor. Chaos feeds on reaction. Calm starves it. Now, when I step outside in the morning, the view is exactly what I hoped for when I first bought this place. The fence stands solid and unchallenged. The pasture is quiet. Ranger and Atlas graze peacefully, lifting their heads now and then before settling back into the grass. There's no shouting, no threats, no tension hanging in the air. Just silence, space, and the feeling that things are exactly where they're supposed to be. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?